In this lecture, we are going to be talking about some architectural developments that occurred in the Romanesque and the Gothic period. Now, for this lecture, I'm not as concerned with you noting time periods. I don't need you to associate specific features with specific time periods. More so, I just want you to know about them and be able to visually identify them. Also, it's my hope that with this lecture, not only are you being introduced to some various architectural features, but maybe I can sneak in a little bit of review and we can review some of the things that we've talked about in previous lectures. So let's start out looking at this magnificent structure. This is a Cathedral of Notre Dame. Now, this is not the super famous one that is located in Paris. This one is located in the city of Chartres. And what we see here is first, we'll start with westwork. So westwork are these two tall towers that you see on the left hand of the screen. Now, these towers, the concept of them should already be familiar to you because we've actually already been introduced to westwork. This is an important addition to churches that dates back to at least the Carolingian period. And that introduction to church architecture was very important because it signified that artists, architects, they were thinking about the impact that the exterior could have on the viewer. The ways in which the exterior, as this person's preparing to enter into the church, could really impact the experience that they're going to have inside. And so we see with the inclusion of westwork, this idea of creating these very soaring, tall, awe-inspiring entrances that really would kind of humble the viewer or really impact the viewer. And it certainly would speak to, the power and the majesty of God. So these towers, these westwork, they mark the entrance way into the church in a very dramatic way. The other feature that we see in this structure is here in the middle, this round circular window. It's called a rose window. And they're identifiable because they have this really lovely, it's almost like a web sort of design, a tracery of stone within the window. And it's kind of a descriptive term, calling it a rose window because it is very evocative of the flower petals of a rose. And I know I just said, don't, match time period with these architectural elements, but I do want to say that we do see the rose window beginning to appear in Romanesque architecture, but really it becomes a kind of mainstay common feature more so in the Gothic period. So I always prefer for my students to associate the rose window with the Gothic period for that reason. Now, here we have another very important addition to the architecture of the late Middle Ages, and that is the flying buttress. Now, let's talk about buttresses just in general, okay? The buttress is essentially used to hold up weight. And an example of this, if you look at the bottom in the front here, between these pointy windows, you can see these rectangular shapes that kind of extend out from the wall. These are examples of buttresses. And the idea is they kind of absorb weight from the wall and they send it down. Now, the flying buttress, this is a new one. Okay, the buttress already was around, but the flying buttress, and this does date to the Gothic period, this was new. If we move up, you can see these kind of like arches that extend out from either side of the structure. These are our flying buttresses. Now, here's the reason why these appear, and it's very ingenious when you think about it. Gothic architecture had to deal with some competing interests. So one thing and this was already starting in the Romanesque period, was this idea that churches were going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this was to accommodate growing numbers of people. Now, there was two reasons for this. First, there was population shifts where people were moving to these more urban areas. So churches had to be larger in size to accommodate larger congregations. Now, on top of this, we know there was also the rise of the pilgrimage, where more and more people were making these religious journeys. They were kind of like religious tourists in a way. And so some of these churches need to be really big because they needed to accommodate large populations at the same time as this influx of religious tourists, these pilgrims. So the churches needed to be really, really big, which means that the walls had to be super sturdy because they had to hold all the weight of these giant structures. But in the Gothic period, it really becomes in vogue to incorporate as much stained glass as you can. And so the problem is you need the walls to bear the weight, but you want the walls to be made of glass, which don't really do a good job bearing weight. And so the solution is a flying buttress. So the idea is when you think about weight, it's kind of like being distributed downwards because of gravity. So if you start at the top and kind of move your way down, then shift your eye to the left, and you can see how the weight would go down, and then it would be carried to the left on top of this flying buttress, and then it would be carried over to this end part here, which is a pier, and then it would be distributed downwards. So the weight bears down, over, down, and then the ground absorbs it. Anything below that arch, that flying buttress, that wouldn't have to bear as much weight because that weight already was distributed away from the structure with that flying buttress above. So very, very smart. Now, speaking of weight bearing, let's move on to the vault. And there was different types of vaults that were developed during medieval architecture. We're going to start with the barrel vault. Now, you can see here on the screen that I have a little definition for you that it's a roof that's based on the arch. Okay, so imagine an arch, and imagine that arch being super thick and long. Just like what you see here, really, really thick, really, really long arch. That is a barrel vault, okay? Now, I just want to say, this is not the first time we're seeing the barrel vault in architecture. The ancient Romans used the barrel vault frequently, and they weren't even the first. We can take it back to Egypt even. So this isn't anything new, but it is new to church architecture. So before they started using vaults, they had flat wooden ceilings. And, just think about how well a flat wooden ceiling is going to be distributing weight. Not very effectively. So the idea is, again, think about gravity moving downwards. So now what would happen is the weight would be distributed down, and then it would be distributed over along the curves of the ceiling. And this was not the strongest of the vaults. We're going to see that they try to make the vaults stronger as time passes. But this is definitely a step up beyond the flat wooden ceiling. So now let's move to the ribbed barrel vault. Okay, so the ribbed barrel vault, we still have, you can see that kind of long curved ceiling. But as I said, it wasn't quite as effective as people hoped or needed. How can we make these ceilings even stronger? That's where the ribs come in. So the ribs, think of like your own ribs and how they function to kind of like support and give shape to your torso. Each one of these like archways that you can see along the top of the barrel vault, they help to even reinforce the weight more, to hold up that barrel vault ceiling and help with that distribution of weight down either side. So ribs are kind of like these exposed supports that help to make sure that the vault, the ceiling, is as strong as possible. So this is definitely more, more strong than our barrel vault. But again, it didn't fit the needs of people that needed structures to be larger in size and bear more weight. And so that encourages the development of the ribbed groin vault. Now, the ribbed groin vault, okay, first of all, you can see the ribs. The ribs are this kind of X shape that you see here, that part that comes off the top of the vault. Now, the difference is, if we go back, they're just one next to the other, the ribs. Here, the ribs crisscross, and that crisscrossing is called a groin. So here's a groin, here's a groin, here's just a regular old arch, groin and a groin. And if you think about, again, distribution of weight, imagine the weight bearing down and hitting the middle of one of these crisscrosses. Now, instead of the weight just being distributed to one on each side, like we see in the rib barrel vault, it'll go to the right or the left. Here, the weight actually is distributed in 4 different directions, which makes these structures even stronger. And then look at these. These are gorgeous. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at English Gothic art. And in England, they took it up a notch or 2 or 3 and created these gorgeous fan vaults. And I think that the one in Westminster Abbey explains, if you look at it, why it's called a fan vault. They look like fans that are coming out, and they're so organic. They look like flowers, really interesting or intricate flowers, or like these come down into the space below. They're almost like the stalactites of a cave. They make me think of like a tree canopy. And so it's this idea that you've got these really just beautiful, very dense, just gorgeous vaults with the fan vault that really help to convey that sense of ornamentation that's so important within the Gothic style. Now we'll move on to the portal, which the portal, put very simply, is the doorway. Now, with the portal, it's kind of the same thing as the westwork, where again, we're looking at this interest to really impact someone as they're entering into a church. And what better way to do that than to create this amazing, fancy, huge doorway? And you can get a sense of scale. I wish this picture had a person in it. But if you look at the bottom, you can see the doors. So that gives you a sense of how big it is. And it really is just that last opportunity to, really get the viewer in this place to, be open to a transformational, a profound spiritual experience when they get inside. So there's a lot of features to the portal. I'm not going to cover all of them in this class. I'm just going to cover 3. First, we've got the tympanum. Now, the tympanum is, if you look in the very middle, you can kind of see it's like triangular shape. It's kind of like, I don't even know what shape this was. I kind of want to say like half moon, but pointy. It's kind of like half circle, half oval, kind of pointy shape that we see in the very middle here. This is the tympanum. It's directly above the doorway. You've got the jam figures, which are on either side. These sculpted figures on either side of the doorway. This one's an interesting one here on the left, like someone holding a severed head. Like I said, that's going to maybe kind of affect you as you're walking in the door. Someone with a severed head. These are the jam figures. And then directly under the tympanum, this central sculpture here is the trumeau. So those are the 3 components of the portal. And then finally, we're going to talk about the nave elevation. So we've already been talking about the nave elevation actually in this class, because what this means, nave elevation, is what you see on either side of the walls of the nave. So you know that we're looking at the nave. This is that long rectangular space where people sit. Here's some chairs to kind of reinforce that, that function. And let's take a look at the very back of the nave. Do you see what's at the very end, this circular stained glass window? Do you remember what that's called? That's the rose window. That's the rose window. Okay, so we have then the nave, the elevation, which again, the walls on either side. So let's start at the bottom. Let's work our way up. Okay, so we know that on either side of the nave are aisles, and that these aisles are divided. There's something that's architecturally built to separate these spaces, and that is what I call the colonnade, because we know that a row of columns is called a colonnade. And we see the row of columns here, but then if you look up a little bit, we see arches, a row of arches. So is this an arcade, or is it a colonnade? Or I came up with the term colonnade. That's how I'm going to become a famous art historian. I made up a term. So we've got the colonnade. Then the next level in our nave elevation is the gallery, which we can see on either side directly above our colonnade. Now, the gallery is not anything new. We have seen the gallery as far back as the early medieval period. We looked at an example when we were looking at Ottonian architecture. And the gallery just kind of had a whatever function. It could be used as a place where the nuns sit to kind of be sequestered from everybody else, or it could be a place where other people could sit, or the choir could be up there, or they could display relics up there, whatever the church wants to do. Now, above the gallery, this is new, and this is the triforium. We start to see the triforium appear in the Gothic period. And the idea is that this allowed for the space to have even more flexibility. This is another kind of like whatever sort of space. And, remember, these structures are getting large. They're getting used by more and more people. And they just really need to be taking advantage of the space. And the triforium allows them to do that. And then finally, at the tip top, here's our row of windows, which is the clerestory. And the row of windows, this is nothing new. We saw this when we were looking at the earliest Christian churches of the 4th century. And actually, that's not anything new either, because we can take the clerestory all the way back to ancient Egypt, because all things come from Egypt. Now, I have seen some people include within the nave elevation the vault. I don't think it should be, because that's a ceiling, it's not the wall. But let's talk about it. What vault do you see here? A little test for you. Well, we see that it's not smooth, so it can't be the barrel vault. We see that it has ribs, the exposed part that shows further support on the vault. So we know ribbed is somewhere in there. We're not seeing fan shapes or like organic tree-like canopy, beautiful, intricate forms. So it can't be a fan vault. And we see that the ribs crisscross. So that has to make it a ribbed groin vault. And this one actually has extra ribs, as you can see here. So this one even has more of a weight-bearing ability than that one I showed you in the previous slide. So some really great examples of architectural development, people really thinking about things and responding to not only stylistic trends, but the needs of the space. And that's really innovative, and it's really exciting.